Great, thank you, Lindsay. As Lindsay mentioned, I'm the Community Planning Capacity Building Coordinator for FEMA Region 2, which covers New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which have seen pretty busy disaster seasons over the last 7 years, from Hurricane Sandy, which hit New York and New Jersey, to 2 Cat 5s hitting Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands in the fall of 2017. So we've certainly been able to test out a lot of the things that I'm going to go through with you today. But I'd like to start off with sort of the history of how the federal government has traditionally done response, how we've structured bringing the federal interagency family into the discussion, and then roll through a couple of recent examples that I think this group might find particularly interesting. So generally when people think about FEMA, they think about the immediate response, incident stabilization, incident management, urban search and rescue. But we look at disasters as cyclical events, and we have programs and support for state and local governments during the response period, for the short and longer term recovery, to do mitigation, which in our language means is more of an adaptation to climate change impacts, and then for individual and household preparedness work. We also view these sort of 4 phases as not as kind of static blocks, but as a continuum. And so response bleeds into recovery, that bleeds into mitigation, that bleeds into preparedness, that bleeds into response. And we're constantly working in all 4 of these areas simultaneously, because of that. So in 2012, we published the National Disaster Recovery Framework, which outlines how other federal agencies can engage with recovery efforts. And this was because of a series of events in the early 2000s that really highlighted that just focusing on response and infrastructure development wasn't cutting it in terms of disaster recovery. So the reconstruction of Lower Manhattan following 9/11, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the series of Gulf Coast hurricanes in the years after that, and then the BP oil spill really revealed that the way the federal government was responding was too narrow. We weren't taking into consideration the larger scale impacts in the health and social services sector around behavioral and mental health following disasters. We weren't taking into consideration natural resource conservation or the way that green infrastructure and nature-based features can improve a community's flood resilience. So the framework is one of 5 that exist that allow us to pull in other federal resources. And the way we do that is we're organized into 6 recovery support functions, which really outline the urban sectors. So my group, the Community Planning Capacity Building Group, is really focused on local community management following disasters. We're focused on land use policy and local changes that can happen. But we bring in folks from the Department of Commerce and from HUD to focus on other urban sectors to make sure that they're recovering in a similar way. And I'll go through sort of a couple of ways that we do that. Initially, when we are activated, when a state requests inactivation of federal resources to support recovery, we come in and we do what we call an advanced evaluation, which looks at what the capacity is of the locally impacted community and where the biggest impacts were and what tools and resources we might have to help support that area. So through that process, we're able to identify if we need to bring in folks from HUD or from Commerce to support economic development. We use that process to make sure that we have all the right players at the table from the federal level. Following that, we do what we call a mission scoping assessment, which starts to identify discrete federal programs and actions that we can bring into that community. And whether that means sort of marrying funding or supplementing funding in certain areas, and I'll get into these examples in a minute. But what we like to do is we really like to try to plan this out as tightly as possible because we're talking about millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into these communities and providing the correct technical assistance and really supporting an outcome-driven approach is important, and we want to be good stewards of that funding. And then finally, we put the strategy in place, which outlines what other partners we can bring in, whether they be academic partners or nonprofit partners, and we use that recovery support strategy as sort of a document that we get buy-in from the state and the local communities on to say, we've done all this background research, we've talked to everybody involved, this is what we think we can bring to the table, like, do you agree with us? And if so, let's move forward with providing these series of resources. Typically, we go through this process very quickly. We do this in sort of the first month or two after a disaster, depending on the scale, and that allows us to really hit the ground and start the recovery process relatively quickly. So my recovery support function really focuses on sort of a couple of key areas, but the ones I'll hone in on today are federal program coordination, modified federal technical assistance, and our ability to do peer-to-peer support, which is sort of the ability to pay for and connect people from across the country or internationally with folks that are going through similar issues following one of their disasters. I also think it's important to sort of outline some of the various funding mechanisms that we have at play. All of you as practitioners and people that are working in the urban forestry space don't necessarily need to know sort of the ins and outs of these, but after a disaster, if someone like me shows up and starts talking through the various ways that we can support, just having a high-level understanding of the different mechanisms that we have will, I think, be very helpful. So we use mission assignments in the immediate aftermath of a storm to deploy federal personnel into an area. So if that is for energy reconstruction, then we'll deploy a mission assignment to send the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Energy out to start rebuilding power lines. If it's records management or historic preservation work, we'll work with the Department of Interior to get their experts on the ground to work with local communities. Further down the line, we use interagency agreements and interagency reimbursable work agreements to do similar work, but we put those in place for roughly a 2 to 4 year period following an event to make sure that there is sustained federal involvement that is financially supported. We can also rely on contract work. We can use invitational travel to bring in that peer-to-peer support that I just mentioned. And we can, obviously we have our staff time and our expertise that we have in our staff to provide sort of direct counseling to communities. So sort of understanding like kind of the bigger, broader framework, let me jump into a couple of examples. So following Hurricane Sandy, we tried to engage in an ecosystem services valuation. And so an ecosystem service valuation is essentially a way of putting a monetary cost on an intangible natural feature. And that's kind of hard to do, but we do have the ability to do so and incorporate some of those benefits, those locally specific benefits, into a benefit cost analysis if we're close enough to getting over the benefit cost threshold. We can start to incorporate nature-based features to kind of get us over that hump. But the hard part here is that the benefits are locally specific. And we can't really put that value on the nature-based feature locally unless we talk to the people that live in that community and understand what their specific needs are. And that process is called a collected value formation. And it's a series of community meetings and direct research that go into figuring out these values. So following Sandy, we brought in, through these various funding mechanisms, the EPA, New York State, NASA and Suffolk counties on Long Island, as well as Stony Brook University and the Nature Conservancy to start doing this research. We held a series of stakeholder meetings that were coordinated by FEMA and the EPA through these funding mechanisms to develop locally relevant values. And we looked at specifically seagrass, oyster beds, and a couple of other sort of natural features that we could then incorporate into the benefit cost analysis for large-scale mitigation projects. And that meant that we were able to then use those values as a stand-in for the incorporation of green infrastructure and nature-based features in recovery projects, which is something that previously we hadn't been able to do. It's still very tricky because a lot of this research takes years and years and years and years to fully gestate. But it's a step in the right direction, and it's something that we've been able to support, in a series of other events moving forward. So the next example is that I think this group would be interested in is a heritage tree mapping project that we're working on right now in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So a heritage tree is a locally significant tree. And it could be because of historic value, it could be because of its physical attributes, or it could just be something that the community has rallied around. It could be, theoretically, it could be the last tree left after a major event. And so what we've done is we've contracted with the Department of the Interior to develop a GIS map of where the publicly owned heritage hardwood trees are in the territory. We're then going to provide that GIS map to the Waste Management Agency, the Department of Public Works. We're going to keep a copy of it so that when we send out teams following the next hurricane to do tree clearings, to put up electrical lines, they're aware of where the heritage trees are, and they're aware of their significance to the community. As a part of that, we're also working with those various organizations and agencies to make sure that the wood that does have to be cut following a storm is separated correctly, so that we can then transfer it to either a local school or local craftsmen so that they can use that wood through their recovery process. And what I think this project highlights is thinking outside of the box on what a recovery project looks like. It doesn't necessarily have to be hard infrastructure. It could be putting in place these policies that enable communities to do a better job of utilizing some of the debris material, for lack of a better word. So the next project that I would like to highlight is another project from the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is around food security. Obviously, the Virgin Islands have to import a large amount of their food, and they're relatively insecure in terms of their ability to access fresh, nutritious foods that are affordable to local residents. So we've partnered with the Iowa State University and USDA Rural Development using this invitational travel mechanism. So Iowa State has agreed to come in and conduct a territory-wide food assessment, host public-facing workshops to publicize kind of what a resilient food system looks like, and to produce a suite of best practices and a toolkit for local producers that they can use in the event of another disaster. And they're doing that all for free, but the federal government, through this mechanism, is able to pay for their travel to come in and do this work. So we are facilitating them getting there. We're putting them up in hotels, and we are supporting sort of the coordination of folks on the ground to make sure that they're able to do this work in a productive and quick manner. And it's a great mechanism that we have that I think that all you should be kind of aware of, to be able to connect what might seem like a very far away academic concept to a direct recovery outcome. Now Iowa State, one, is building sort of these toolkits, but they're also building these relationships. So down the road, should something happen, or should the University of the Virgin Islands want to engage in a cross-school, cross-disciplinary curriculum development, they have the relationships with Iowa State and some pre-built tools that they can use. And so the final example I'll run through is just how we can use federal staff time to support community-based outcomes. So in Hawaii, following the Kilauea lava flows last year, they lost about 2,000 homes were either completely destroyed or cut off from access. And what the county government and the state government have recognized is that those residents need to find an affordable place to live that's relatively in the same area that they were, because they can't go back to kind of living where they were. And the mechanism that they've landed on is the development of a community land trust, which is basically a nonprofit organization holding a land lease for a certain area and allowing folks to build on it. They can retain ownership of the structure and the improvements, and so they're extracting some value out of that. But because the land is held in perpetuity by this nonprofit, it keeps kind of the overall affordability of that area in check. And so we've assigned FEMA staff to work directly with the nonprofits and the county to kind of develop the guidelines that they're going to be using to develop a series of data analysis around affordability and around best practices. And this highlights sort of another role that FEMA can play in recovery, which is sort of this role of neutral convener, where we don't necessarily have the right idea and we don't know exactly what's right for this community, but we do know that they have an idea, and we do know that we have the ability to bring people to the table. And so we can kind of coordinate the meetings and bring people in to start the discussions, to track things and to move things forward. And that's really kind of what our main prerogative is to make sure that all people in the community are being heard and have input into what's going on. And we have these various tools that we can use to bring folks in and, or, marry up federal funding to, push out additional resources across sort of the suite of recovery, right? So if we start these conversations in response with, folks like Lindsay or folks like Traci and Nancy, we are able to then better provide services down the line. We can do a better job kind of right in the immediate response recovery phase when we're writing those recovery support strategies to say, okay, we know that we're going to need resources in this area over the next couple of months. Let's develop out how we can bring them down and fund them and keep them going for 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, 10 years if we have to. In the case of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands right now, it's going to probably be about 10 years that we're down there trying to support. I mean, I know we're still supporting activities from Sandy, and that's a high-capacity city and high-capacity states, and we're still working on recovery efforts there. So like Lindsay was saying earlier, just expanding our timeline and our horizon is something that FEMA's been working on. We're very focused on making sure that we are supporting the entire community in their recovery process. So I hope that was a pretty quick and succinct overview of some of the resources that we've been able to provide, some of the work that we've been able to do, and I will turn it back over to Lindsay, but I'm looking forward to any questions anybody might have.